Here's something that might blow your mind. Almost everything you think of as a traditional American Christmas, the elaborate tree covered in lights and ornaments, the excessive gift-giving that starts in November and doesn't stop until your credit card begs for mercy, the competitive decorating that turns suburban neighborhoods into winter wonderland, the department store Santa Claus, the guilt-driven charity donation, even the idea that Christmas should be the biggest, most important, most expensive holiday of the year, was basically invented by wealthy people in the late 1800s who were trying to out-Christmas each other in increasingly elaborate displays of wealth and social status. Before the Gilded Age, Christmas in America was a minor holiday that most people barely celebrate, a quiet religious observance if you were Christian, and just another day if you weren't. 50 years later, it has transformed into the massive cultural and commercial event we recognize today, complete with all the excess and anxiety and social pressure that makes December simultaneously the most wonderful and most exhausting time of the year. And that transformation happened because families like the Vanderbilts and the Astors decided that Christmas was an excellent opportunity to demonstrate their wealth, their taste, their generosity, and their superiority to everyone around them. This is the story of how America's wealthiest families took a modest religious holiday and turned it into a competitive sport, how commercialism and sentimentality combined to create modern Christmas, and how traditions that we think of as timeless and authentic were actually invented by people with more money than sense trying to impress their equally wealthy neighbors. If you're watching with tired eyes and an overthinking mind, this story is for you. If you really enjoy these bedtime journeys through history, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these stories are keeping you company. Before the Gilded Age, roughly before 1870, Christmas in America was nothing like what we experience today. It wasn't a major holiday. It wasn't a commercial event. It wasn't even uniformly celebrated across the country. In fact, large portions of America either ignored Christmas entirely or marked it with such minimal observation that you could easily miss it was happening at all. The Puritans, who had enormous influence over early American culture, especially in New England, actively disapproved of Christmas celebration. They considered it a corrupted Catholic holiday with pagan roots, believed that celebrating Christmas was idolatrous and unbiblical, and in some cases actually made Christmas celebration illegal. Massachusetts banned Christmas observance from 1659 to 1681, and even after the ban was lifted, celebrating Christmas remained socially suspect in Puritan-influenced areas for generations. You could be fined for not working on Christmas Day. Stores stayed open. Schools held classes. Christmas was just December 25th, another Thursday or Monday or whatever day it happened to fall on. Other parts of the country had different traditions, depending on who had settled there. Germans brought their Christmas tree customs and made a bigger deal of the holiday. The Dutch in New York had their own winter celebrations that eventually merged with Christmas. Catholics observed it as a religious feast day. But there was no unified American Christmas, no shared set of traditions that everyone participated, no sense that this was supposed to be the most important day of the year, requiring months of preparation and massive financial investment. The holiday was quiet, modest, and largely private. If you celebrated at all, you might go to church, you might have a special meal, you might exchange small gifts, an orange, some nuts, a handmade item, something simple that cost almost nothing. But the idea that Christmas required elaborate decorations, expensive presents, competitive displays of holiday spirit, and commercial shopping that started before Thanksgiving would have seemed completely insane to Americans in 1850. Christmas was a day, not a season. It was religious, not commercial. It was private, not performative. The Civil War changed things, as wars often do. When you have a country torn apart by conflict, when families are divided and soldiers are dying, and everything feels uncertain and terrifying, people start looking for symbols of unity, peace, and shared values. Christmas, with its emphasis on family, peace on earth, goodwill toward men, became increasingly important as a unifying force. It was something both Union and Confederate soldiers could celebrate, a brief moment of humanity in the midst of horror. There are accounts of informal Christmas truces, of soldiers singing carols across enemy lines, of both sides taking a day to remember they were human beings, with families and homes, rather than just combatants in an endless war. When the war ended and the country began trying to rebuild and reunify, Christmas emerged as one of those cultural touchstones that could bring people together across regional, political, and even racial divisions. It became more important, more widely celebrated, more central to American culture. But it was still relatively modest, still primarily religious and family-focused, still nothing like the massive commercial and cultural event it would become once the Gilded Age wealthy got their hands on it. The real transformation began in the 1870s and 1880s, when America's newly wealthy industrial families, people who had made enormous fortunes in railroads, steel, oil, banking, all the industries that were turning America into an economic superhouse, decided that Christmas was an excellent opportunity to demonstrate their wealth, taste, and cultural sophistication. These were families who had money so new it practically still smelled like coal and steel, who were desperate to prove they deserved their fortunes, who competed constantly with each other over who had the biggest mansion, the most impressive art collection, the most elaborate parties. Christmas became another arena for this competition, another way to show that you weren't just rich, but refined, not just wealthy, but cultured, not just successful, but worthy of your success. The Christmas tree is the perfect example of how Gilded Age wealthy families took a modest tradition and turned it into an elaborate status symbol. Christmas trees had existed in America before the Gilded Age. German immigrants brought the tradition with them, and Queen Victoria's German husband, Prince Albert, had made Christmas trees fashionable in England in the 1840s, which meant American families who wanted to seem sophisticated and connected to European culture gradually adopted the practice. But early Christmas trees were modest affairs, small evergreens decorated with homemade ornaments, strings of popcorn, paper chains, maybe some candles if you were feeling fancy and didn't mind the fire hazard. They were charming, certainly, but they were also simple, inexpensive, accessible to ordinary families who could cut a tree from nearby woods and make decorations from materials they already had. Gilded Age wealthy families looked at this modest tradition and thought, we can make this so much more expensive and elaborate that ordinary people couldn't possibly compete with us. They started importing trees, not just cutting them from local woods, but having them shipped from specific regions known for particularly perfect evergreen. They wanted trees that were taller, fuller, more symmetrical, more impressive than anything their neighbors had. If your tree was 8 feet tall, theirs needed to be 12 feet. If yours was in the parlor, theirs was in the grand hall where everyone could see it immediately upon entering the house. The Vanderbilt family, never ones to do anything halfway, reportedly had Christmas trees at their various mansions that reached 15 or even 20 feet tall, requiring ladders to decorate, dominating entire rooms with their size. These weren't trees you could just bring home and set up. They required professional installation, teams of servants to position them correctly, structural reinforcement to make sure they didn't topple over and destroy thousands of dollars worth of decorations and possibly injure someone in the process. And the decorations became absolutely insane. Homemade ornaments and popcorn strings were for poor people. Wealthy families commissioned custom ornaments from jewelers and craftsmen, glass balls imported from Germany that cost more per ornament than ordinary families spent on Christmas entirely, gilded fruits and birds and angels, elaborate garlands made from expensive materials, ribbons imported from France. Some families had ornaments made with real gold leaf or decorated with semi-precious stones, or designed to match their home's decor scheme so that the tree coordinated with the wallpaper and furniture. The Astor family, always competitive with the Vanderbilts about who could display more wealth and taste, reportedly had Christmas trees decorated with ornaments that were essentially jewelry, delicate glass balls with gold and silver filigree, tiny figurines made by European craftsmen, decorations that cost hundreds or even thousands of dollars and were stored in special boxes the rest of the year, like the valuable objects they were. It's like if you decorated your Christmas tree entirely with Tiffany jewelry and designer accessories. Technically festive, but mostly just an elaborate flex about how much money you could spend on temporary decorations. The candles on these trees were a particular status symbol and also a particular hazard. Electric Christmas lights didn't exist yet. Edison's light bulb was only invented in 1879, and electric lighting in homes was rare and expensive for decades after. So wealthy families used hundreds of real candles on their trees, which created a beautiful, romantic, incredibly dangerous glow that required servants standing by with buckets of water and sand in case the entire tree went up in flames. Some families had their trees lit for only an hour or two on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day because the fire risk was so severe. Others took the risk and left candles burning for hours, essentially playing Russian roulette with their expensive decorations and their wooden mansions. There are accounts of Christmas tree fires in wealthy homes throughout the 1880s and 1890s, trees going up in flames, rooms being destroyed, occasionally entire mansions burning down because someone's elaborate Christmas display turned into an elaborate Christmas disaster. But the risk was apparently worth it for the dramatic effect of hundreds of candles, making glass ornaments sparkle and creating the kind of magical atmosphere that would impress guests and demonstrate that you had both the money to decorate elaborately and the staff to manage the constant fire hazard. By the 1890s, there was an entire industry devoted to supplying wealthy families with Christmas decorations. Stores in New York and other major cities had Christmas departments that opened in November and sold ornaments imported from Germany, France, and Austria. Catalogs featured pages of decoration options at various price points, though the wealthy obviously bought from the top tier, the most expensive, the most elaborate, the most impressive. Department stores started creating Christmas window displays in the 1880s. Elaborate scenes that drew crowds of people who pressed their faces against the glass to see animated figures, elaborate landscapes, fantastical Christmas scenarios that were essentially advertising for the decorations and gifts available inside. Macy's in New York became famous for its Christmas windows, creating increasingly elaborate displays each year that became tourist attractions in their own right. Other department stores competed to have the most impressive windows, the most creative scenes, the most crowd-drawing displays. It was free advertising that also served to normalize the idea that Christmas required extensive shopping, that the holiday should be elaborate and commercial, that celebrating properly meant spending money on decorations and gifts and all the accessories that stores were only too happy to sell you. The Christmas tree competition among wealthy families got so intense that society pages started reporting on who had the most impressive tree each year, describing decorations in detail that would let readers compare and judge whose Christmas was most elaborate. It's like Instagram influencers competing over whose holiday decor is most impressive. Except instead of social media likes, they were competing for mentions in society columns and invitations to each other's parties based on who was setting the highest standard for seasonal excess. Gift-giving before the Gilded Age had been modest and practical. Children might receive an orange or some nuts, maybe a small toy or a book if their family had money to spare. Adults exchanged simple gifts if they exchanged gifts at all. Handmade items, useful household objects, nothing expensive or elaborate. The whole practice was constrained by the fact that most people didn't have disposable income to spend on presents, and also by the cultural understanding that Christmas was primarily a religious holiday rather than a commercial one. Gilded Age wealthy families transformed gift-giving into something completely different, an elaborate social ritual where the value and thoughtfulness of gifts reflected and reinforced social relationship, where giving impressive gifts demonstrated your wealth and taste, where receiving expensive gifts confirmed your importance in social hierarchy. Gifts became a way to communicate status, affection, alliance, and obligation all at once. Wealthy families started giving each other gifts that cost hundreds or thousands of dollars: jewelry, art objects, expensive books, elaborate toys for children that were essentially miniature versions of adult luxury items. There are accounts of Gilded Age children receiving dollhouses that were perfect miniatures of their family mansions, complete with tiny furniture made by the same craftsmen who made the full-size versions. They received miniature carriages pulled by actual ponies, child-size versions of their parents' cars, elaborate toy trains that cost more than many working families earned in a year. Adults gave each other gifts that were essentially investments: expensive jewelry, valuable art pieces, rare books, objects that retained value and demonstrated the giver's wealth and taste. Husbands gave wives diamond bracelets and pearl necklaces. Wives gave husbands expensive watches and gold cufflinks. Friends exchanged gifts, calculated to demonstrate affection without being so personal as to suggest inappropriate intimacy, expensive enough to honor the relationship, but not so expensive as to create obligation the recipient couldn't reciprocate. The social calculus of gift-giving became incredibly complex. You had to give gifts that matched your social position. Too cheap, and you looked poor or stingy, too expensive, and you looked like you were trying too hard or attempting to buy friendship. You had to match what you received. If someone gave you a gift worth $500, you needed to reciprocate with something similar in value or risk social embarrassment. You had to remember who gave what in previous years so you could escalate appropriately. Relationships were supposed to deepen over time, which meant gifts should increase in value and thoughtfulness to reflect that deepening connection. It's exhausting just thinking about it. This elaborate social chess game played out through gift giving, where every present carried multiple layers of meaning, and one misstep could damage relationships or social standing. It's like the anxiety of modern gift giving, trying to find something thoughtful but not too personal, expensive but not inappropriately so, something that shows you know the person but doesn't reveal that you've been paying creepy amounts of attention, except multiplied by Gilded Age social hierarchies, where everything was being judged and compared and reported in society pages for everyone to analyze. Alva Vanderbilt, who never did anything halfway, reportedly gave Christmas gifts that were basically small fortunes. There are accounts of her giving friends and family members jewelry worth thousands of dollars, art objects that ordinary families could never afford, gifts so expensive that receiving them created an obligation to reciprocate at similar level, or at minimum, to remain in Alva's good graces and accept her social dominance. The gifts weren't really about generosity. They were about demonstrating power, showing that she had so much wealth she could give away fortunes as Christmas presents, reinforcing her position at the top of New York's social hierarchy. Other wealthy families competed to give impressive gifts, creating this escalating arms race where each year's presents needed to be more elaborate and expensive than last year's. If you gave someone diamond earrings one year, you needed to give them a diamond necklace the next. If you gave a child an expensive toy, next year it needed to be an even more expensive toy, or risks suggesting your fortune was declining and you could no longer afford to maintain previous standards. Department stores recognized this trend and started catering specifically to wealthy customers looking for impressive gifts. They created Christmas shopping departments with items at various price points, but always emphasizing the high end. Jewelry counters with diamond bracelets and pearl necklaces, toy departments with elaborate dollhouses and miniature carriages, book departments with leather-bound volumes and rare editions, home goods departments with expensive vases and art objects that would make appropriate gifts for hosts and social acquaintances. Shopping for Christmas became a major social activity for wealthy women starting in November and extending through December. They would spend hours in department stores examining options, consulting with staff about appropriate gifts for various relationships, arranging to have purchases wrapped and delivered to recipients. It was treated as serious business requiring considerable time and attention. This process of selecting gifts that would properly reflect relationships and social positions while demonstrating the giver's taste and wealth. Stores loved this, obviously. Christmas became their most profitable season, the time when wealthy customers spent lavishly on gifts for extended family, friends, servants, business associates, social acquaintances, basically everyone in their social orbit who required acknowledgement through gift giving. By the 1890s, stores were doing as much as a third of their annual business during the Christmas season, a pattern that's continued and intensified to today when retailers depend on holiday shopping to make their entire year profitable. The commercialization of Christmas that we complain about today, the shopping that starts before Halloween, the pressure to buy the perfect gifts, the sense that Christmas has become more about spending money than about family or religion or anything meaningful, started with Gilded Age wealthy families treating Christmas as an opportunity to demonstrate wealth through elaborate gift giving, and stores recognizing they could profit enormously by catering to and encouraging this trend. Christmas cards seem innocent enough today. You buy a box at Target, maybe get a family photo printed on them, send them to relatives and friends you don't see regularly, call it done. But in the Gilded Age, Christmas cards became another arena for competition and status display, another way for wealthy families to demonstrate their taste and social connections and cultural sophistication. The Christmas card tradition started in England in the 1840s, but didn't really take off in America until Louis Prang, a German immigrant and talented lithographer, started producing high-quality Christmas cards in the 1870s. Prang's cards were beautiful, elaborately designed, printed in multiple colors using chromolithography, which was cutting-edge technology at the time, featuring everything from winter landscapes to religious scenes to flowers and birds and decorative patterns. They were essentially small art prints, expensive enough that sending them demonstrated you had disposable income for something purely decorative and social. Wealthy families embraced Christmas cards enthusiastically because they served multiple purposes. They were a way to maintain social connections with people you didn't see regularly, family in other cities, business associates, social acquaintances who weren't close enough to warrant gifts, but important to acknowledge. They were a way to demonstrate your taste through the cards you selected. Prang offered various designs at various price points, and choosing expensive artistic cards showed you appreciated fine things. And they were a way to subtly communicate your social position through the sheer number of cards you sent. Sending hundreds of cards proved you had extensive social connections worth maintaining. The Astor family, always conscious of their social position and the importance of maintaining connections, reportedly sent Christmas cards to hundreds of people each year. Family, friends, business associates, social acquaintances, basically everyone in their extensive network who needed to be reminded of the Astor family's existence and goodwill. Caroline Astor, New York's social queen, used Christmas cards as another tool in her gatekeeping arsenal. Receiving a card from Mrs. Astor confirmed your social standing. Not receiving one suggested you'd fallen from favor or had never achieved sufficient importance to warrant her notice. Other wealthy families competed over who sent the most cards, who sent the most expensive cards, who sent cards with the most impressive designs, or the most personal messages. Some families commissioned custom Christmas cards with their monograms or family crests, essentially turning Christmas greetings into another form of status display. It's like people today who send elaborate holiday photo cards with professional pictures and custom designs. Technically, it's just a greeting, but it's also a way to communicate that you have your life together enough to plan and execute an elaborate card, while others are buying generic boxes from drugstores. Keeping track of who sent you cards and who you needed to send cards to it was a significant administrative task for wealthy households. They maintained lists of recipients, noted who sent cards each year so they could reciprocate, updated addresses as people moved or social relationships shifted. Some families hired secretaries specifically to handle Christmas card duties, selecting cards, addressing envelopes, managing the lists, making sure cards went out on time and to the right people. By the 1880s and 1890s, not sending Christmas cards could be interpreted as a social snub or a sign that your fortune was declining and you could no longer afford even basic social courtesies. The practice had gone from optional novelty to expected obligation in barely a decade, driven by wealthy families who treated Christmas cards as another opportunity to perform their social positions, and by the companies that profited from selling increasingly elaborate cards to status-conscious customers. Department stores started carrying Christmas cards alongside decorations and gifts, creating one-stop shopping for all your holiday needs. They displayed cards at various price points, but always pushed the expensive options, the elaborate multicolor prints that cost 50 cents or $1 per card, when ordinary workers earned $1 or $2 per day. Catalogs featured pages of Christmas card options, describing designs in detail, and emphasizing the quality of printing and paper. The message was clear. If you were someone who mattered, you sent Christmas cards, and the quality of those cards reflected your social position. The tradition of sending Christmas cards spread beyond wealthy families to middle-class Americans who wanted to participate in fashionable practices, even if they had to buy cheaper cards and send fewer of them. By 1900, sending Christmas cards had become a standard American tradition, expected and ubiquitous, something that we continue today without thinking about how it started as a status symbol for wealthy families who wanted another way to demonstrate their social connections and refined taste. Now let's talk about Christmas charity, which sounds lovely and generous until you understand that for Gilded Age wealthy families, charity was often less about helping people and more about public performance of generosity, social competition over who could be most charitable, and managing public opinion about wealth inequality that was becoming impossible to ignore. The Gilded Age was defined by stark contrast between extreme wealth and devastating poverty. You had families like the Vanderbilts living in mansions with dozens of servants, spending thousands of dollars on Christmas decorations, while just blocks away people were living in tenements without heat or adequate food, working 12-hour days in dangerous conditions for wages that barely covered rent and basic necessities. The inequality was visible, undeniable, increasingly difficult to justify with claims about hard work and merit, when everyone could see that success had more to do with birth and luck than anything else. Christmas became a time when wealthy families addressed this inequality through charitable giving that was carefully calculated to manage their public image, while not actually threatening the social and economic structures that maintained their wealth. They gave to the poor, certainly, but in ways that reinforced social hierarchies rather than challenging them, that positioned wealthy donors as benevolent superiors rather than as beneficiaries of an unjust system, that made poverty seem like an unfortunate circumstance that could be ameliorated through charity rather than a structural problem requiring systemic solution. Wealthy families organized Christmas charity in various forms. They donated to organizations that distributed food and clothing to the poor. They hosted Christmas dinners at settlement houses and missions where poor families could receive a special meal. They distributed Christmas baskets with food and small gifts to families identified as deserving poor, meaning families who were poor through no fault of their own, who behaved respectably, who were grateful for assistance and didn't demand it as a right. These charitable efforts were always well publicized. Society pages reported on which families donated what amounts to which causes, creating competition over who could demonstrate the most impressive generosity. It's like modern celebrities posting about their charitable donations on social media. Technically, it's still helping people, but it's also clearly about public image and status competition, about being seen as generous rather than just being generous privately without recognition. The Vanderbilt family was particularly aggressive about Christmas charity, possibly because they were aware that their enormous wealth made them targets for criticism about inequality and wanted to position themselves as benevolent rather than rapacious. They donated to multiple charities, hosted Christmas events for poor children, and gave elaborate Christmas baskets to their servants and estate workers. Cornelius Vanderbilt II and his wife Alice were known for their Christmas charity work, though critics noted that they spent more on decorating their mansion for one Christmas than they donated to charity all year, which somewhat undermined claims about generous spirit. Alva Vanderbilt, always strategic about public image, made sure her charitable activities were well documented and publicized. She hosted Christmas parties for poor children, where she distributed gifts and treats, while newspaper reporters observed and wrote glowing accounts of her generosity. The children received small toys and candy, inexpensive items that cost Alva almost nothing relative to her fortune, but generated significant positive publicity about her charitable nature. The competitive element of Christmas charity was particularly evident in how wealthy families tried to outdo each other in displays of generosity. If one family hosted a Christmas dinner for 100 poor children, another family needed to host dinner for 200. If one family donated $1,000 to a charity, another family donated $2,000. The competition was ostensibly about helping people, but it was really about social status and public image, about demonstrating that you were not just wealthy, but also generous and socially conscious. There's something both admirable and deeply cynical about this Christmas charity. On one hand, poor families did receive help they desperately needed: food, warm clothes, toys for children who otherwise would receive nothing. The charitable impulse, whatever motivated it, did result in tangible benefits for people who were struggling. On the other hand, the charity was carefully structured to avoid challenging the systems that created poverty in the first place, to position wealthy donors as generous benefactors rather than as part of the problem, to make inequality seem manageable through occasional generosity rather than requiring fundamental change. The poor were expected to be grateful for what they received, to demonstrate appropriate humility and appreciation, to confirm wealthy donors' sense of themselves as generous and benevolent. Any suggestion that poverty was structural rather than individual, that wealthy families bore responsibility for conditions in their factories and tenements, that charity was inadequate compensation for systemic exploitation, these were unwelcome and would disqualify you from receiving assistance, since you clearly weren't deserving poor, but rather ungrateful troublemakers. By the early 1900s, Christmas charity had become an expected obligation for wealthy families, something you did to maintain your social position and manage public opinion. Not participating in Christmas charity suggested you were selfish or stingy or lacking in social consciousness. The amount you gave and the publicity you generated from your giving reflected your social importance. Major families gave large amounts to prominent charities and made sure everyone knew about it, while minor wealthy families gave smaller amounts to less prominent causes and received correspondingly less recognition. The tradition of Christmas charity that we maintain today, the donation drives, the toy collections, the food banks, the sense that Christmas is a time to remember those less fortunate, comes directly from Gilded Age wealthy families who use charity as social performance and public relations strategy. We've hopefully added more genuine concern for helping people and less obvious status competition. But the basic framework of Christmas as a time for charitable giving to the poor was established by wealthy families who needed to manage their public image during an era of stark inequality. By 1900, the transformation was complete. Christmas in America had gone from a minor, unevenly observed religious holiday to a major cultural and commercial event that defined the entire month of December and required months of preparation. The traditions that we think of as timeless, elaborate Christmas trees, extensive gift-giving, Christmas cards, charitable donations, the general sense that Christmas should be the biggest and most important holiday of the year, had all been invented or dramatically transformed in barely 30 years, driven by wealthy families competing with each other and by commercial interests that profited from encouraging increasingly elaborate celebration. The wealthy families who invented modern Christmas weren't trying to create traditions that would last for generations or to establish meaningful cultural practices. They were mostly just trying to outdo each other, to demonstrate their wealth and taste and cultural sophistication, to show that they deserved their fortunes through their refined sensibilities and generous spirits. But in the process of this status competition, they created frameworks that spread beyond their social circles to middle-class and eventually working-class Americans who adapted these traditions to their own circumstances and budgets. Middle-class families couldn't afford 15-foot trees with jeweled ornaments, but they could have smaller trees with more modest decorations. They couldn't give diamond jewelry as Christmas gift, but they could exchange smaller presents that demonstrated thought and affection. They couldn't send hundreds of expensive Christmas cards, but they could send cards to family and close friends. They couldn't make large charitable donations, but they could contribute what they could to local causes. The traditions filtered down through social classes, adapted and modified, becoming more democratic and accessible, even as they retained some of that original Gilded Age emphasis on display and competition and performance. By the 1920s and 1930s, Christmas looked essentially like it does today. Elaborate decorations, extensive gift-giving, cards sent to extended social network, charitable donations, the sense that Christmas was the most important holiday requiring the most preparation and expense. Electric lights had replaced candles, making trees safer and allowing even more elaborate displays. Department stores had perfected the art of Christmas marketing, creating entire seasonal shopping experiences designed to encourage spending. The commercial aspects that we sometimes complain about today, the early shopping season, the pressure to buy perfect gifts, the sense that Christmas has become too commercial, were already fully established, the inevitable result of traditions invented by wealthy families and promoted by businesses that profited from increasing elaboration. What's fascinating is how quickly these invented traditions came to feel natural and timeless, how rapidly people forgot that Christmas as we know it was created by specific people for specific purposes in specific historical circumstances. By the 1920s, Americans already thought of elaborate Christmas trees and extensive gift-giving as ancient traditions rather than recent inventions, already felt that Christmas had always been celebrated this way rather than understanding that their grandparents or great-grandparents had experienced completely different and much simpler holidays. This is how tradition works. Practices invented for one purpose get adopted more widely, acquire emotional significance and historical weight, eventually become so embedded in culture that questioning them feels like attacking something sacred rather than examining recent inventions. Modern Christmas feels traditional because we've been doing it for several generations, because our grandparents celebrated similarly and taught their children who taught us. But if you go back just a bit further, you find that Christmas was completely different, that the traditions we consider essential and timeless were actually created by people with specific agendas in specific historical moments. The Gilded Age invented American Christmas, took a minor religious holiday, and transformed it into a major cultural and commercial event, established traditions that we still follow today without thinking about their origins or purposes. Wealthy families competing over status created frameworks that spread throughout American culture. Commercial interests promoting consumption established patterns that define how we celebrate. Charity work positioned as a generous obligation created expectations about remembering those less fortunate during the holiday season. All of it working together to create modern Christmas. This complicated mix of religious observance and commercial excess, family tradition and social performance, genuine generosity and obligatory giving that defines our December experiences. Understanding this history doesn't mean you can't enjoy Christmas or that traditions are meaningless because they were invented rather than ancient. But it does provide useful context for why Christmas feels the way it does, why it includes all these specific elements, why we feel pressure to celebrate in particular ways that require significant time and money and emotional energy. The anxiety you feel about finding perfect gifts, decorating appropriately, sending cards to everyone who sent you cards, donating to charities, creating magical experiences for children. That anxiety is built into traditions that were created by wealthy people treating Christmas as status competition, and by businesses that profit from encouraging increasingly elaborate celebrations. The wonderful thing is that despite these origins, Christmas has become genuinely meaningful for many people, has evolved beyond its status competition roots to become a time for family connection, generosity, reflection, joy, whatever personal meaning individuals and families bring to it. The traditions may have been invented by wealthy people showing off, but they've been adapted and transformed by generations of Americans who found genuine value in them, who made them meaningful through practice and repetition and emotional investment. When you put up your Christmas tree this year, you're participating in a tradition that started with wealthy families competing over who could have the most impressive decorations. When you stress about finding perfect gifts, you're experiencing pressure created by Gilded Age social rituals about demonstrating relationships through gift-giving. When you send Christmas cards and donate to charity and feel guilty that you're not doing enough or doing it right, you're responding to expectations established by people trying to manage their public image during an era of stark inequality. But you're also participating in traditions that have acquired genuine meaning through generations of practice, that connect you to family and community, that make December feel special even when it's exhausting. The Gilded Age invented American Christmas, but we've made it ours through adapting and personalizing these traditions, through finding meaning beyond status competition and commercial promotion. Understanding the history doesn't diminish the value. It just helps explain why Christmas is the way it is, and why it makes us feel the specific combination of joy and stress and obligation that defines the season.